Imagine a city where the air was thick with the scent of coal in the constant thrumming heartbeat of heavy machinery. In 1920, Scranton, Pennsylvania wasn't just the town, it was the electric city, a titan of the American Industrial Revolution. And at the center of its crown sat a kingdom made of thread. This was the Scranton Lace Company. At its peak, it was the largest producer of Nottingham lace in the world. It didn't just make curtains, it made a way of life. It was a city within a city, boasting its own coal mine, its own cotton fields in the south, its own gymnasium, bowling alley, and infirmary. If you worked here, you weren't just an employee, you were a citizen of an empire. But today, the kingdom is silent. In 2002, the empire didn't just fade away, it didn't slowly decline over decades like the steel mills of Pittsburgh or the car plants of Detroit. It was murdered. One day in mid-2002, the whistle blew. The workers were told to put down their tools for a short meeting. They never picked them up again. They walked out of the doors, leaving half-finished lace still sitting on the looms, their lunchboxes still in the lockers, and their lives in the rearview mirror. How does a global leader in textiles, a company that survived the Great Depression and 2 world wars, vanish in a single afternoon? To find the answer, we have to follow a trail of greed that leads away from the factory floor and into the dark offices of a man history remembers as a con man. A man who realized that the company's real value wasn't in the lace it produced, but in the carcass he could strip bare. This is the story of the rise of an American icon, the secret world of the Nottingham looms, and the calculated betrayal that killed America's lace empire. To understand the fall, you have to understand the magic of what was lost. In the late 19th century, lace was the ultimate status symbol. It was the software of the Victorian era, intricate, difficult to produce, and incredibly expensive. Nottingham, England held the global monopoly. They had the machines, the Nottingham looms, which were massive 20-ton behemoths of cast iron and thousands of moving parts. They were so complex that the British government actually banned the export of the machines and the plans to build them. They wanted to keep the white gold of lace production on British soil. But Scranton had something England didn't: the Lackawanna Valley's anthracite coal. In 1890, a group of English businessmen and local Scranton investors realized that if they could smuggle the expertise in the machines across the Atlantic, they could bypass the massive tariffs on imported lace. They didn't just build a factory, they transplanted an entire culture. When the first Nottingham looms arrived in Scranton, they were treated like visiting royalty. These machines were 3 stories tall and 50 feet long. They were masterpieces of engineering that used punch cards, a primitive form of binary code, decades before the first computer was ever conceived, to weave patterns of breathtaking complexity. By 1900, Scranton Lace wasn't just competing with England, it was winning. Working at Scranton Lace was the gold standard of labor. If you got a job there, you were set for life. The company understood something that modern corporations have long forgotten. If you take care of the worker takes care of the empire. The factory had a theater for plays, it had a barber shop, it had a fully staffed hospital. During the hot Pennsylvania summers, the company would provide ice-cold drinks and organize sports leagues. But it wasn't just about the perks, it was about the pride. The Scranton Lace Company produced the highest quality lace in the world. From the White House to the humblest farmhouses in the Midwest, Scranton Lace was the fabric of the American dream. When World War II broke out, the Lace Kings didn't stop, they pivoted. Those massive looms were recalibrated. Instead of delicate parlor curtains, they began churning out mosquito netting for soldiers in the Pacific, camouflage netting for snipers, and specialized parachutes for bombs. The factory ran 24 hours a day, fueled by a sense of patriotic duty. But as the 1950s dawned, the world began to change, and in the shadows, a new kind of businessman was watching.
The modern era and the first cracks. The 1950s were the beginning of the end for many traditional American industries, but Scranton Lace was a survivor. The problem wasn't the quality, it was the fashion. The heavy, ornate lace curtains of the Victorian era were being replaced by the mid-century modern look: clean lines, plastic, and synthetic fibers. The leadership at Scranton Lace saw the writing on the wall. They didn't panic, they adapted. They moved into laminates. They started making vinyl shower curtains, patio furniture covers, and even pool liners. They were still profitable, still the big house on the hill. But this period of transition made them vulnerable. To modernize, the company needed capital. And in the world of high finance, capital often comes with strings attached. This is where our story takes a dark turn. In the mid-20th century, the company's stock began to be traded more aggressively. For decades, the stock was held by local families, people who lived in Scranton, who walked past the factory every day, whose kids played on the same baseball teams as the loom operators. But slowly, that stock began to migrate to New York and Philadelphia. It fell into the hands of outside investors. In 1958, a man named Alexander Guterma entered the picture. If you want to understand the con man archetype that eventually killed the company, Guterma is the blueprint. He was a financial wizard who specialized in what we now call asset stripping. Guterma didn't care about lace. He didn't care about the 1,400 families who relied on the factory. He saw a company with huge physical assets, massive buildings, valuable land, and expensive machinery. And he saw a way to use those assets as collateral for his own shady deals. Guterma was eventually caught and sent to prison for stock fraud, but the damage was done. He had shown the world that Scranton Lace was a fat target. He had proven that you could make more money by destroying the company than by running it. Through the 70s and 80s, the company struggled against a new enemy: globalism. Cheap textiles were flooding in from overseas. The Nottingham looms, once the pinnacle of technology, were becoming antiques. They were slow compared to modern computerized looms, and they required highly skilled lace weavers, a dying breed of craftsmen who knew how to read the punch cards like a musician reads a score. The company shrunk. The bowling alley closed. The infirmary was shuttered. The workforce dropped from 1,400 to 500, then to 200. Yet, despite everything, Scranton Lace remained a point of pride. The remaining workers were the old guard. They knew the machines by their sounds. They could tell if a thread had snapped 3 rooms away just by the change in the vibration of the floorboards. They believed the company would last forever because it always had. They survived the Great Depression. They survived Guterma. They survived the plastic revolution. They didn't realize that the final predator was already inside the building. Enter the man who would pull the plug. In the late 90s, the company was under the control of a new leadership group. On the surface, they talked about revitalization and retooling for the 21st century. They promised new contracts and government grants. But behind the scenes, the finances were being hollowed out. The con wasn't a simple theft, it was a sophisticated bust-out. In a bust-out, the people in charge intentionally run up debt, stop paying taxes, and stop maintaining the equipment, all while pocketing the remaining cash flow and selling off the company's hidden assets. In the case of Scranton Lace, the most valuable asset wasn't even the lace, it was the equipment and the historical prestige. The workers began to notice strange things. The heat wouldn't be turned on in the winter. The raw cotton shipments were late. Suppliers started calling the factory floor, demanding to speak to accounting because their checks were bouncing. The con man at the helm kept smiling. He told the union leaders that things were just tight because of the economy. He told them to keep the looms running. Just one more big order, he would say. Once we ship this, we'll be back in the black. It was a lie. The date was mid-2002. It was a Tuesday. The sun was shining over the Lackawanna River. Inside the factory, the 110-year-old looms were roaring, producing a beautiful floral pattern destined for a high-end boutique in New York.
The day the music stopped. On that Tuesday in 2002, the silence was louder than the noise had ever been. For over a century, the Scranton Lace Company had a sound. It was a mechanical symphony, a percussive, rhythmic thumping that you could feel in your teeth if you stood on the sidewalk outside. It was the sound of prosperity. But at 12 p.m., the power was cut. The workers, many of whom were third or fourth generation employees, looked at each other in confusion. There was no smoke, no fire alarm, just the dying groan of 20-ton machines losing their momentum. The foreman climbed onto a crate. His face was pale. He didn't have a speech prepared because he hadn't known it was coming either. He simply said, "Pack your things. The gates are being locked in 30 minutes." This wasn't a layoff. This wasn't a restructuring. This was an abandonment. The con man at the top, the executive leadership, had realized the walls were closing in. The taxes hadn't been paid in years. The pension fund, which thousands of retirees relied on, had been borrowed against until there was nothing left but an empty ledger. The bank was moving in to seize the property, and the owners decided to vanish before the process servers arrived. While the workers were standing in the parking lot, clutching their personal belongings in cardboard boxes, the leadership was already gone. They hadn't just closed the business, they had scuttled it like a sinking ship. In the weeks leading up to that final whistle, the con reached its peak. Documents were shredded. High-value portable assets, specialized tools, historical records, and liquid cash were moved into private accounts. The workers were told their final paychecks were in the mail. Those checks never arrived. The health insurance they thought they had? It had been canceled months ago, even though the premiums were still being deducted from their paychecks. This is the hallmark of a corporate con. The predator keeps the prey calm until the very last second so they can extract every last drop of value. What happened next is what makes Scranton Lace the holy grail of urban exploration today. Because the closure was so sudden and so legally messy, the building became a time capsule. Usually, when a factory closes, there's a liquidation sale. Auctioneers come in, they tag the machines, and everything is sold for scrap or to competitors. But because the ownership of Scranton Lace was tied up in a web of fraudulent shell companies and mounting lawsuits, nobody could touch it. The city of Scranton couldn't seize it for taxes because the legal knots were too tight. The banks couldn't sell it because the environmental liabilities were too high. So for nearly 2 decades, the factory sat exactly as it was at 12:01 p.m. that Tuesday. Inside, the lace was still on the looms. The punch cards, those massive stacks of cardboard that told the machines how to weave, remained hung in their racks. In the office, calendars remained turned to 2002. In the break room, a newspaper headline from that week warned of a down economy, oblivious to the fact that for these workers, the economy had just ceased to exist.
The mechanics of the fraud. To the public, it looked like a business failure. To the Department of Labor and the IRS, it looked like a crime scene. How does a con man kill an empire? It's not about one big theft. It's about 1,000 small cuts. This is the vulture capital playbook that has been used to dismantle countless American brands, from Sears to Toys R Us, but Scranton Lace was one of the first and most brutal examples. The strategy began by saddling the company with debt it didn't need. The con man takes out massive loans using the factory's real estate as collateral. On paper, this money is for innovation. In reality, the money is paid out to consulting firms owned by the executives themselves. The company gets the debt, the con man gets the cash. This is the cruelest part of the story. The Scranton Lace workers were loyal. Many had worked there for 40 years. They stayed because of the promise of a pension, a guaranteed income in their sunset years.
The leadership stopped funding the pension while telling the employees everything was fine. They used the pension money to pay interest on the predatory loans they had taken out. When the factory closed, the workers discovered that the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow had been replaced by an IOU signed by a ghost. By 2002, the Scranton Lace Company owed millions to the city and the federal government. But the con man knows that the government moves slowly. By the time the IRS finally showed up to lock the doors, the executives had already dissolved their primary corporation and moved the remaining assets into a new entity. It was a shell game. By the time the law caught up, the lace empire was a hollowed-out shell, and the people responsible were sipping cocktails in Florida or hiding behind layers of LLCs in Delaware. "We were a family," one former weaver said in a 2010 interview. "You didn't just work at the lace, you belonged to it. When they locked those gates, they didn't just take our jobs, they took our history." The impact on Scranton was devastating. The electric city lost its pulse. The tax revenue vanished, contributing to the city's eventual distressed status under Act 47. But while the city suffered, the factory itself began to transform. It was no longer a place of production, it was a monument to abandonment. Nature began to reclaim the Scranton Lace Company. Rainwater leaked through the roof, rusting the 20-ton English looms. Mold grew on the delicate lace patterns. The clock tower, which had kept time for the city for over a century, finally stopped. It became a ghost factory, and like all ghosts, it started to attract those who wanted to speak to the dead. As the years passed, Scranton Lace became a legend in the URBX community. Photographers from around the world risked arrest to climb through those shattered windows. What they found was haunting. Because the power had been cut so abruptly, the factory felt like the people had simply evaporated. They found lockers with photos of children pinned inside. They found the color lab, where chemists had spent decades perfecting the exact shade of ivory for wedding veils, now filled with rows of rotting chemical bottles. But most of all, they found the lace, miles and miles of it. Some of it was still pristine, wrapped in plastic, waiting for a customer who would never come. Some of it was draped over the machines like cobwebs, a poetic image of an empire that choked on its own thread. We are now entering the final acts of this industrial tragedy, the lingering decay, the failed resurrections, and the ultimate transformation of the site. The decay and the vultures. For over a decade, the Scranton Lace Company sat in a state of industrial purgatory. It was too big to ignore, too expensive to fix, and too legally toxic to touch. While the con men who steered it into the ground moved on to their next victims, the factory became a skeleton that the city of Scranton had to live with every single day. But a funny thing happens when you leave a kingdom unattended. The vultures arrive. The stripping of the bones. As the legal battles between the banks and the former owners dragged on in distant courtrooms, the local scrappers began to move in. They weren't looking for lace, they were looking for the red gold, the miles of copper wiring and brass fittings that powered the massive Nottingham looms. Night after night, thieves broke through the chain-link fences. They didn't just steal, they destroyed. They smashed the century-old control panels to get at the wiring. They ripped the lead flashing from the roof, accelerating the water damage that was already eating the floorboards. This was the second murder of Scranton Lace. If the executives killed the company's soul, the scrappers were dismembering its body. And yet, even in its broken state, the factory held a strange power. It became a pilgrimage site, not just for thieves, but for artists. Photographers from across the globe traveled to Scranton to capture the lace ghosts. There was something hauntingly beautiful about a 20-ton machine of war-era steel being draped in the finest, most delicate lace ever made, now gray with dust and damp with rot. The mystery of the clock tower. The clock tower remained the sentinel of the valley. It was the highest point in that part of the city. For generations, the people of Scranton set their watches by that clock. It represented the reliability of the American worker. When the factory died, the clock stopped. For 15 years, the hands remained frozen at the exact moment the power was cut. It was a constant, mocking reminder to the citizens below that time had run out for their industrial heritage. But then, something strange happened. In the middle of the night, long after the factory had been abandoned, people reported seeing lights in the tower. Rumors spread. Some said it was the ghosts of the weavers. Others said it was a secret squatting community living in the rafters. The truth was even more depressing. It was the sound of the building literally groaning under its own weight. The massive cast-iron bells that once signaled the start of a shift were now hanging by rusted bolts, threatening to crash through 3 stories of rotting timber.
The final lesson and the new life. By 2016, the story of the Scranton Lace Company finally reached a turning point. After nearly 15 years of abandonment, a group of developers stepped in with a $40 million plan. But they weren't going to make lace. The plan was for the Lace Village, luxury apartments, high-end lofts, and trendy retail spaces. It's a story we see all over the Rust Belt. The places where our grandfathers sweated and bled are being turned into industrial chic living spaces for people who have never touched a loom in their lives. The erasure of history. To save the empire, they had to destroy most of it. Many of the outer buildings were demolished. The 20-ton Nottingham looms, the ones that had survived the Atlantic crossing in the 1890s, the ones that had made mosquito netting for the boys in the Pacific, were sold for scrap metal. They were too big to move and too heavy to keep. They were cut into pieces with torches. When the looms were destroyed, the last physical connection to the Nottingham era was severed. The lace empire was officially dead. All that remained were the bricks. The warning for the future. So what is the legacy of the Scranton Lace Company? Is it just a story about a con man and some old machines? No, it is a warning. It's a warning about what happens when we value stock price over craftsmanship. It's a warning about the vulnerability of the American worker when the people in the boardroom don't live in the same zip code as the people on the factory floor. The Scranton Lace Company didn't fail because people stopped wanting lace. It failed because it became more profitable to kill it than to keep it alive. The con man didn't just steal money, he stole a legacy that took 112 years to build, and he did it in a single afternoon. Today, people live in those lofts. They sleep in the rooms where the looms once roared. They walk their dogs where the weavers once stood in line for their paychecks. The Lace Village is a success story for real estate developers, but for the city of Scranton, it is a scar that has been covered with a fresh coat of paint. The empire is gone. The con man is a footnote, but the ghosts of the Scranton Lace Company remain in the walls, whispering a story about a time when America made things that lasted, until someone decided that the end of the thread was worth more than the tapestry itself.